Our first speaker this afternoon is Bethany Monroe DeBorde. And publishing continually since 1880, the River Press is the second oldest weekly newspaper in the state, and the oldest in one location, Fort Benton. The River Press archives offer a first draft of Montana history as it unfolds in the state's birthplace, now serving as an important resource for historians and genealogists. Bethany Monroe DeBorde has worked as a journalist in Oregon, Washington, and Montana for nearly 2 decades, spending the past 11 plus years with the River Press in Fort Benton. After working several years as a River Press reporter, she purchased the newspaper in 2017 and has served as editor and publisher ever since. So I'd like to welcome Bethany to the podium.
Thank you very much. Bear with me, folks. I am used to hiding behind the camera and my notebook. I'm not used to being up front here. So this is very new for me. But thank you for having me today. And as she mentioned, the River Press is the second oldest weekly in the state. Does anyone know who can claim to be the oldest operating weekly newspaper? Anyone? Ennis, correct, the Madisonian in Ennis, which technically they started in Virginia City and then they moved to Ennis, but they've been in operation, I think, since 1873. So we came around 7 years later. All right. Sorry, I'll try to hold it still and project. All right. So I honestly try not to think about it too much in my weekly day-to-day work, how much history this newspaper has, because it's kind of a lot of pressure. I don't want to be the one to mess it up, to shut it down. And I think, as you all know, newspapers are in decline around the US. In fact, Pointer had a report that said that Northwestern University found in a study that the rate of local newspaper closures has accelerated to 2.5 per week in 2023. So more than 130 papers had closed or merged in that year. And we're on track to lose a third of our papers since 2005. So it's rather dire. The good news is in Fort Benton, that's not happening at the moment. We're going strong. So hopefully we will have a better story. I just realized I stapled this backwards. That's going to be interesting. Like I said, I'm new to this. So like I said, I don't want to jinx anything, but at this point, the River Press is here to stay and plan to keep that history going. And why are we talking about newspapers at a history conference? Well, newspapers are kind of the first draft of history. They're telling the play-by-play as it happens. And so historians and genealogists frequently use newspapers, I'm sure many of you in this room, to do research and to read about what was going on at the time and how it was perceived at the time. The River Press actually came along quite a while after Fort Benton was established. 1846 is when Fort Lewis was established, and then the following year they moved it down the river, created Fort Benton. So almost 3 decades went by. But at the time, it's not too surprising that there wasn't a newspaper yet, because it was a pretty transient environment. There weren't a lot of people setting down roots, bringing their families, establishing a community in those first early decades of Fort Benton. So, and actually, we were not the first newspaper that Fort Benton had. The Benton Record came around in 1875. So that was Fort Benton's first paper. They did not last a little under a decade until they folded. But Let's see. So I'm curious today, have any of you used the montananewspapers.org tool, or it's now merged with newspapers.com to do research of many of Montana's, I know you have, Ken, lots, to do research for many Montana newspapers have been digitally archived, which is amazing because it used to be, as many of you know, you had to sit with microfiche and just weed through searching for what you were finding. Now we can do word searches and it just takes you right there. It's extremely efficient, not perfect, but it helps a lot for doing research. And that's all available to you just online to anybody for free at any time. So I will show you real quick. This is the page that you go to. So an easy way to get to it is to just go to the Montana Historical Society website. And then there's a research tab. Then you'll click online collections and you'll find this page with digitized Montana newspapers. So what I use is the public access portal. And that's where you'll find all of the River Press archives dating back to 1880, as well as the Benton Record archives and many other historic newspapers from around the state. It is a wonderful, wonderful tool. I should also mention, this was made possible by the Montana Historical Society, and also locally, Lippard Claywater Foundation provided funds to get the River Press digitized. It's quite a process to have to scan all of these old newspapers and digitize them. It costs quite a bit of money to make it happen. So it's pretty exciting that we're to this point that we have a full, complete archive. That's only been the case in the last 5 or so years. The downside to this resource is that it's quite a rabbit hole. I have a very hard time staying focused when I'm doing research on there. I get distracted by all of the old ads, and there's just you come across just the zaniest things sometimes in these papers, and then it'll get you wanting to find out more. And so while it is an efficient way to look, you may not be the most efficient if you're like me, because you'll just find it so interesting. And so here's just an example of a few of the ads that I came across from 1880 when I was getting distracted. You'll see like there's a Chinese laundry ad. This is for a barber shop. I had to look that up because I wasn't familiar with that terminology. And then the Shoto House, they're claiming to be the largest and best hotel in Shoto County, which if you've been to Fort Benton, we're known for the Grand Union Hotel, but this was 1880 and the Grand Union hadn't been built yet. So they had that little claim for a very brief time. And then I just pulled 1950 as well for some vintage ads that are just kind of fun. Let's see, like we have an old movie theater ad with a Katharine Hepburn movie. Grocery ads are fun because you can see what all the prices were at the time. Men's clothing, I liked that they had a price for a white shirt or a fancy t-shirt. You paid a little more for the fancy t-shirt. I'm not sure what that meant. Appliances. So you can really learn a lot, even just from the advertising in these old papers, about the culture, about what was going on in society at that time. That also brings me to a point, though, that can be a little bit jarring, which anyone that works in history is familiar with this. You're reading things that were written 100 years ago or whatever time, and they are not politically correct. They are sometimes very racially insensitive, misogynistic. You'll come across all kinds of things, and you're like, I can't believe they printed that, or that they would say that. That's terrible. So it is a first draft of history. It is not a complete history, right? You're just seeing the perspective of the editor of that day, and age, and often they did leave out a lot of perspectives that were important. So we're never really getting that full, complete picture, but and racial slurs. I mean, it's jarring at first. But I think it's good for us to have that and to see, to learn from it, right? You know better, you do better, and we learn history so that we don't repeat it, right? Getting ahead of myself. Let's see. All right, so I'm going to give you a little bit of info on kind of how the River Press happened, how the newspaper came to be. So I have to give credit to the Benton Record. They were, as I said, the first newspaper in Fort Benton. They started February 1st, 1875. And W.H. Buck was the name of their editor, publisher. I want to read you his intro on the front page. I did not know this until recently, and I found it kind of funny. Our long connection with temperance interests had caused us to cherish a desire to establish in this territory a journal wholly devoted to the advancement of temperance efforts. Can you imagine how well that would have gone over in Fort Benton in 1875? But recent inquiries have assured us that such an enterprise cannot as yet be sustained. So they decided to just do a regular newspaper instead of telling everyone they should quit drinking. Lots of history is recorded in the Benton Record, from the fur trade era, the steamboats, the logs of the steamboats coming up the river. Fort Benton is known as the world's innermost port at that time. It was a very important hub, as many of you know, for bringing goods up and down the river out west to Montana Territory, to Canada. So it was a bustling place at that point. Some of you may be familiar with the colorful character John Healy. He was actually an editor of the Benton Record for a time. He was also sheriff in Choteau County. A bit controversial. In fact, he's part of the reason that the River Press got started. The founders of the River Press were not happy with how the Benton Record was covering Choteau County's government, including John Healy, and how that they were promoting Healy as a sheriff candidate. And they felt like he was not the best option for Choteau County. They wanted to promote a different candidate. So these three guys got together, and they only had about $50 between them. So they had to find some investors. They did find that in members of the Republican Party or the Republican Committee. The Benton Record tended to lean more Democrat, so they were eager to get a more Republican perspective. So they were able to rally the support and get a newspaper going. And those three gentlemen were H.C. Williams was the first editor, Thomas D. Wright was the business manager for the paper, and then J.E. Stevens handled the printing. So they put out their first issue October 27th, 1880. And as you can imagine, the Benton Record was not happy. And editor Buck from the Benton Record actually said they're not going to last a month. And it started a war between the two papers. This is their introduction from the River Press crew. In their first paper, they said, "We present to our readers this week a paper which is in typographical execution and general appearance is the equal of any in the West, and we have endeavored to make its columns interesting by presenting a class of matter so diversified and original as will please all tastes. Our local record is full and complete, while in our editorial comments we have been fair and impartial." They did do a endorsement for sheriff in that very same issue. So I don't know how impartial they were, but that was their goal. And they called out the Benton Record. They did not mince words. The two papers would go back and forth throwing barbs at each other. A few, I think a month or two later, after the River Press has been reporting on the county and how they're spending this money and not accounting for it properly, the Benton Record had an article that came out that said, called Eating Crow was the title. And this is what he had to say about the River Press. The editor of the River Press in this week's issue has a lame apology for his gross misstatement of the county debt, but with the characteristic obstinacy of all weak minds, attempts to justify his inexcusable errors. The same dense ignoramus, too, whom we are credibly informed help him write the editorials of the first issue, again comes to his assistance in that loose, incoherent, disconnected tirade that nobody can understand. So they really went back and forth, which I think was probably good for business. You kind of had to buy both newspapers to keep up on what was happening and decide whose side you were on. So then he decided, the River Press, a few months went by, they were still going. And so the Benton Record editor decided he was going to start a daily newspaper, and that'll really shut him down. So he did. In 1881, he launched a daily Benton Record, and the River Press guys just wouldn't go away. These was a scrappy crew. They stuck around and they decided to launch their own daily. So now Fort Benton has 2 daily newspapers, which is unheard of for a town of its size. But they actually kept it going for several years, until 1884. Buck had to eat his words because he ended up being the paper that closed and the River Press stayed in business. They went back and forth in their editorials about all kinds of things that were of interest. One point that I find interesting was they needed to build a school in Fort Benton, and they were trying to decide if it should be segregated. Do they need 2 schools, or do they put all of the children in one? Because they had Native students, they had white students, they had Black, Asian, Chinese. So the River Press was on the perspective that it doesn't make sense to have 2 schools. We need to have one. Their side did end up prevailing. I need to hustle up because I'm taking too long. Like I said, I get distracted easily. So, that was the Eating Crow story. We're going to jump ahead a little bit to Jeremiah Collins bought a share in the newspaper in 1881. And some of you might recognize his name because he later moved to Great Falls to start the Great Falls Tribune in 87. Fort Benton River Press got a new owner, William H. Todd, who got into a bit of a war with T.C. Power, who was a very powerful businessman in Fort Benton and elsewhere at the time, also getting involved in politics. And they did not see eye to eye. T.C. Power did not like how he and his family were being covered, and he started a boycott of the paper. He pulled all of his advertising. He started his own newspaper very briefly, the Fort Benton Review. He ended up winning in the end because he ended up buying out Todd and owning the paper. Then he brought in Harbor. William K. Harbor came over from England. Somehow his family had purchased interest in the newspaper. So he came over to kind of see how it was going and ended up staying. He and his wife raised their 3 daughters in Fort Benton. He worked at the River Press as the editor for about 30 years. He is very well known in Montana history for his editorials. He wasn't necessarily, he was pretty measured. He wasn't super outspoken and brazen, but he did have things to say and people would listen. The River Press was still an independent paper. And at that time, the Copper Kings were buying up newspapers and they were controlling a lot of the news that was getting out. So the River Press was kind of hanging on as an independent voice and speaking up a little bit more from the people's perspective and not just the rich copper kings. In fact, I spoke with the great grandson of William Harbor recently, and he's a lawyer, and his son is a lawyer, and his son worked on the Citizens United, trying to get the Supreme Court to overturn Citizens United, and he actually cited his great-great-grandfather, William Harbor, and what he had to say about political financing from back then. So I thought that was pretty cool. And then Harbor's youngest daughter, Nora, she never married. I'm told she was about 4'6" or 4'7" is how he remembered her. Tiny woman, but she ended up having a very active role in the newspaper and kind of followed in her father's footsteps. I've got to get to Joel Overholser before we wrap up, because he is also absolutely key in the river, in Montana history, honestly. He became an editor. His father was editor of the paper, and then Joel followed in his father's footsteps. And until about 1980 is when Joel retired. And he retired so that he could write Montana history books, Fort Benton history. He has published several. And during his time as editor of the newspaper, there is lots of Montana history recorded. He did a lot to research and preserve that history. In fact, I brought a few of his, he would do special publications sometimes for, this one was World's Innermost Port. Some of these he didn't do, but the centennial of the steamboats. He would just, incredible amount of work put into his historic research. Anyways, I'm gonna fast forward to today. We're still going. We still publish weekly on Wednesdays. As far as I know, it's always published on Wednesdays. We're now printed in Helena. It hasn't been printed on site since I think the 1970s. And we're distributed throughout Choteau County, around the state, and we have quite a few out-of-state subscribers too who have a connection to Fort Benton and like to stay connected. So thank you so much for listening. I could probably just ramble on all day.